Hey guys, how you doing? So welcome to chapter 6. We're going to take a look at survival through regulation. We're going to take a look at how animals and organisms survive and regulate their body to match their external environment. And so we have a word for this. It's called homeostasis. And so we're going to take a look at a few different things. We're going to look at physiology and how the body functions in response to a few different stresses in the environment. And then we're going to take a look specifically at homeostasis with respect to a few different areas such as body temperature, body fluids, and things like that. Okay, so let's jump into it. Survival through regulation, chapter 6. Now in this video we're going to really look at physiological pathways that our body can regulate, in particular in terms of heat. Okay. So heat gain and heat loss, there are about 4 ways in which heat is transferred from the environment. The first one is called conduction, when there is a direct transfer. We call that conduction, when heat moves from one contact to another through that immediate contact. You grab a hot object and the heat conducts from the hot objects into your hands. That's called conduction. Convection is the movement through air and water. So, for example, convection currents in the air. When you turn on the fan, that causes a bit of convection. That is another way in which heat can move. The third one is radiation through infrared. So radiation is not through physical contact from warmer objects to cooler objects, the release of infrared rays, which also heats up the object as well. And the last one is through evaporation, which is heat loss only by evaporation of water. Right? So heat gain can occur through when ambient temperatures are higher than the body temperatures. Right? And so radiation, conduction, convection can all happen as a method of heat loss. Of heat gain. Whereas with heat loss, it can occur through all 4 of those different ways. Okay, and so here's just an example of a few of them. So conduction is direct contact, radiation from the sun, convection, the movement of air currents and water currents, and then also radiation coming from the light or the infrared coming out from the fire as well. Okay, now evaporation I want to take a look at specifically because evaporative cooling or evaporative heat loss is an example of how your body can cool down and remove heat. So as water changes from a liquid to gas, it actually requires energy to change in that process. That process is called evaporation, and as it evaporates, it draws heat from the surface, causing the surface to cool down. And so, for example, you jump into the pool, you get out of the pool, and you immediately start to notice is that when you're out of the pool, and the wind blows, you immediately get cold and you start to shiver because what happens is, and when the wind blows, it causes the water on the skin to evaporate, and as it evaporates, it takes heat energy away from your skin, cooling it down. Now, two factors drive the process of evaporation. When air is dry on a very dry day, evaporation happens higher, and also when it is windy, it also happens at a higher rate. Conversely, it's often poorest when it's humid and the air is still. So you take your washing out on a really humid day, you come back in the afternoon and it might still be soggy or wet because that evaporation process is a lot slower on a humid or still air day. Okay. Physiological methods. So physiology is relating to the body's functions, and so physiological methods is how does the body respond to the methods of heat loss and heat gain. Okay, so physiological means it's not under the person's control. It occurs automatically and is regulated by the hypothalamus in the brain. One such example for heat gain, three examples of heat gain is shivering. Shivering is the involuntary contractions and relaxation of muscles. Almost all of the energy from the muscle contraction turns into heat as a way of heating up the body, so it allows you to gain heat. Okay. That is a physiological thing. When you go out into the cold weather, you will naturally start to shiver after a period of time because your muscles are naturally contracting, relaxing very, very rapidly in order to increase your metabolism and gain heat. Piloerection, in other words, your hair standing up on end. For humans, this is probably not so effective because our hair, we're not very hairy creatures, and so the hair standing up doesn't really do a whole lot. But for a lot of mammals, when hair stands up, it traps a layer of air beneath the hair, and it insulates the body as a result of that. So piloerection is a really effective way of retaining heat or heat gain. Metabolic processes. Metabolic heat is a side effect of your metabolism, which is when you burn glucose for energy. Heat is a byproduct of that. In fact, about 60% of the energy from your food goes to heat. Yeah, which means that you lose most of the energy in the form of heat, and then the other 40% is what you actually use for your day-to-day activities, such as thinking and activity, muscles and stuff like that. These metabolic processes produce heat, and when you speed up your metabolism, you heat up more, which is why, when you're cold, you go for a run, and then you start to warm up because your body has produced more heat, and it retains that heat inside of your core body. Right. Now, your basal metabolic rate is the minimum level of metabolism needed to survive, which is what you would do if you were at rest, not doing any sort of physical activity or anything strenuous, and that's what your body just simply needs to run, basically, minimum function. Okay. So your body is able to increase this rate through the stimulation of hormones to produce heat, and so your body can increase this metabolic rate whenever it senses that it needs to gain more heat, and then conversely can slow it down when you need to cool down as well. Okay, and so the different hormones that regulates your body are all involved here, and so there's a few for you to think about that play really important roles. Your hypothalamus regulates a lot of your body's activities, and it increases your thyrotropin, which is releases a particular hormone that regulates a lot of your body temperature. Your pituitary gland is your growth hormone. Many of your activities, otherwise known as kind of like the master gland in your body, because it's the one that releases all your hormones that regulates your growth and things like that. Okay, your thyroid, which is sort of sits right around your trachea, releases a particular hormone called thyroxine, and thyroxine speeds up or slows down your metabolic rate. Your adrenal glands releases adrenaline, which makes sense, responding to stress. Your pancreas releases insulin or glucagon, which monitors your blood glucose level, and then also your reproductive organs, your gonads, such as your testes, which produces testosterone, and your ovaries, which produces estrogen, right? Or your fertility and sex characteristics, yeah? And so hormones play a really important role in the body because they are your chemical signals to start some sort of change in your physiology, the way your body functions. And so really important for survival, because for you to regulate your body, you need these hormones and therefore these organs to be working properly. Okay. Physiological ways. So there's a few different ways. Another way is what we call vasodilation, which is heat loss, or vasoconstriction, which is heat gain. So your veins or your blood vessels have quite a spectacular ability to expand or constrict to increase or decrease blood flow, and therefore increase or decrease the amount of heat flowing to the skin and away from the skin. Right, and so you've got the structure of the artery coming in from here. There is a muscle that can clamp called the sphincter muscle, and what it does is it redirects the blood flow. You've got a shunt vessel. So, for example, if the skin is this layer up here, right? If it is a particularly cold day, then what will happen is your body needs to retain heat, and the sphincter will close, and the artery will redirect the blood straight through the shunt vessel into the vein. And what it does is, by doing that, is bypasses the layer and reduces heat from the skin. When it's a hot day, you need to lose more, or you've done a lot of physical activity, it redirects it through the network of arterioles and venules up towards the skin. And then because it's close to the skin, the heat leaves the skin and away from the body. Now, this is obviously just as a regulatory method for gaining and losing heat through your blood vessels. But obviously, all of your cells at some point or another will need the nutrients, the oxygen and stuff like that from the blood. And so it does sort of redirect back into these areas depending on the need, right? Which is why, for example, when you take a shower, right? And then you take a shower and then you get out of the shower and your body's kind of really heated up. and your blood vessels are kind of opens up and stuff like that. And then you jump into, like say for example, a cold water bath or something. It constricts all of that, and then it limits the amount of the heat loss that you experience, and you kind of overheat a little bit as well. Okay. Now, those are physiological ways. There are behavioral ways that you can do as well. So, for example, if you want to conserve or gain heat, you can exercise vigorously. You can put on more clothes. You can, have a hot drink and all these kind of things. And then there are behavioral ways for you to lose heat as well. Putting on an ice pack, removing any layers of clothing, taking a cold shower, sitting in front of a fan. All of these things are all behavioral methods. Okay. Now, we're going to take a look at homeostasis. What is homeostasis? And then we're going to take a look at some of the methods in which your body regulates homeostasis for your survival. Okay. Definition of homeostasis. The word homo means same, and the word stasis meaning state. So homeostasis means to have the same state. So homeostasis is an outcome. It is the result of maintaining a steady state within the body. Maintaining a steady or a stable internal condition, often despite fluctuations in the environment. Okay. So the functions of chemical processes, your enzymes and your organelles within the body, have a specific requirement. It needs to be within a certain zone, and those conditions need to be met in order for the organism to function. So your cells need to be within a narrow range of a few different parameters in order to survive. However, the outside environment doesn't always contain those conditions, and so homeostasis is for the organism to be able to maintain the inside of the body within that narrow range, even though the outside of the body, the environment, can fluctuate up and down and so forth. Okay. Now, there's a few key terms you need to know. Metabolism. Metabolism is the sum of life-sustaining chemical processes occurring in the body. When your body burns glucose for energy, that is a metabolic process that happens when you digest food. That is a metabolic process happening. It is a chemical process in the body that allows you to survive. And so your basal metabolic rate, as we mentioned earlier, is the metabolic rate of an organism at rest, without any strenuous activity there at all. Now, what are some of the parameters you need to keep in check? The first one is your body temperature. Your core temperature within your cells need to be sitting somewhere between 36.1 to 39. That is your normal tolerance range, also called core temperature. Your blood glucose level needs to sit at 3.6 to 6.8 millimoles per liter. Within these limits, regardless of your diet, your body needs to maintain the glucose level within that range, and it uses chemicals and hormones to do that. Water. Your metabolism happens in water, and therefore you need to have a certain amount of water. Ions such as calcium also sit at about 2.3 to 2.4 millimoles per liter. pH at 7.4. Blood pressure, and also waste in the blood as well. So all of these things are parameters that your body needs to regulate in order to survive. If it falls outside of that range, you're in trouble, and it needs to regulate. So your body needs to be really good at regulating those things. For us to understand homeostasis, we need to understand it through a few different models. Okay, so we call this the stimulus response model. The stimulus response model is when an organism's internal conditions fall outside of this range because of some sort of stimulus, some sort of change in the environment that it is exposed to, and then because of that stimulus, it starts a response in the body that adjusts it to return to normal. So you've got a stimulus that causes some sort of change, and then the organism responds, and the change often counters the initial stimulus. So for example, if there is a fall in body temperature, you walk outside on a cold day, then it causes a response in the body, such as shivering, and that response increases your body temperature, which is the opposite of what was happening originally in the first place, bringing it back into balance. Okay. Now, that's the basic method of understanding a stimulus response model. There are actually 5 levels in the stimulus response model, which is something that you need to be familiar with. This model helps us understand how the body feeds back to itself and changes and regulates its abilities, and it involves a few different areas. Okay, so starting with the stimulus is often the change in condition that you experience. A drop in body temperature, a drop in blood glucose level, and a change in blood pH, for example. The Change then needs to be detected, and that is through the receptor. So the receptor is detecting some sort of change. It sends that information to a modulator or a control center, and the control center is what decides what sort of actions need to be taking place. And then it gets sent to an effector. An effector is a part of the body that is able to make that adjustment. Your muscles, your pancreas, your liver, whatever. And then the response is the corrective action that is taking place. And so you get through this kind of this loop of stimulus, receptor, modulator, effector, and then the response. And then the response stimulates or a change that counters the original change, right? Which is what we call feedback. Now, the adjustment is called the feedback, and you can have two different types of feedback. If the feedback is countering the initial change, it's called a negative feedback. Negative not meaning that it's bad, but negative meaning that it's opposite to the original change. However, the feedback can also reinforce the initial change, which is what we call a positive feedback. Okay, there's a negative feedback loop, and here's an example of what a feedback loop would look like. Okay, so for example, decrease in body temperature falls below the normal rate, and so when a decrease in the body temperature falls outside of that tolerance range that your body is ideal, below 36.1 for example, then it needs to be detected. So the receptor is the thermoreceptors on the skin. It is a nerve, and it is often some sort of nerve, sensory nerve, that is able to detect that change, right? So in this case, it is on the skin, because the skin will be the first to detect the temperature change, or perhaps around the organs or the hypothalamus of the brain. Okay, it then sends that information back to the brain and says, hey, the skin has experienced some sort of drop in body temperature. You need to do something about it. The modulator or the control center is often the hypothalamus, which then sends a signal via your nerve and your hormonal system to the effectors. And so the hypothalamus might send a nerve signal to the muscles, or perhaps maybe a hormone sends to a particular organ or something like that. And then it is those muscles or those organs, like your blood vessels in the skin, would enact on that change, right? And so your skeletal muscles might contract and release rapidly, causing you to shiver. Your skin vessels might start to vasodilate or vasoconstrict. In this case, vasoconstrict, because there is a drop in body temperature. And then your cerebral cortex might initiate some sort of behavioral change, like, for example, put on some more clothes. And then your body cells might increase their metabolic rate naturally to bring your body back into its right temperature. And so the response is now the action that's taken place. Shivering, the vasoconstriction of the skin vessels, behavioral changes such as putting on more clothes, and increasing the metabolic rate of each of your cells to increase the body's heat production. Okay, and then as a result, the feedback in this particular case would mean that the temperature will rise back to its normal range, 36.7 for example. And in overall, this feedback loop is called a negative feedback loop, because you start off with a decrease in body temperature, you end with an increase in body temperature, bringing it back into the homeostasis kind of range. Okay, so that is an example of a negative feedback loop. Okay, an example of a positive feedback loop, it's a bit more rarer than a negative feedback loop, because a negative feedback loop often will counter change. A drop in blood pH will increase blood pH, drop in blood glucose level will increase blood glucose level, etc. However, there are a few examples of a positive feedback loop. Okay, so a good example of it is during labor. So during labor, the cervix is particularly sensitive it contains a lot of sensory organs around the cervix, which is right at the end where the vaginal opening is. And during a pregnancy, when the baby grows large enough and it reaches into that kind of stage, the head of the fetus will push against the cervix. Now, this creates a nerve impulse from the cervix, and it gets transmitted to the brain. So basically, the cervix will receive that kind of the push feeling from the head of the fetus, sends that nerve impulse to the brain. It stimulates the pituitary gland to secrete more oxytocin. Now, oxytocin will then be carried in the bloodstream to the uterus, and then what happens is the oxytocin will stimulate the uterus to contract, and therefore push the head of the fetus further into, push further into the cervix. And so you can see there that during labor, the initial pushing the head of the fetus will stimulate the brain to release more oxytocin from the pituitary gland, and then the oxytocin will go into the uterus and force the uterus to contract even more, pushing the brain even further, and then therefore it kind of becomes more intensifies every time. And so initially in labor you get small contractions will build because that process is happening, and that's a positive feedback loop. Yeah, not to say that it's a positive thing, but to say that it reinforces the initial change. Okay. Another example that's a slightly irrelevant, for example, in climate change, when the climate warms, we use or buy more air conditioning. When we use more or buy more air conditioning, we use up more energy, release more CO2, and the climate warms even more. And so that's another example of a kind of a larger scale, irrelevant, positive feedback loop. Okay. We're going to stop it there, and then in the next video, we're going to have a look at body temperature. I hope you guys enjoyed that, and I'll catch you guys later.